Welcome to another not so casual conversation this time. We're talking to Mark Verhagen from Oxford University. He is an expert in machine learning, and we're going to talk about this idea of Moneyball for law. Mark, we've been talking for the last couple of months, and I'd love your synopsis of this problem we're trying to solve.
If I would have to give a synopsis of the problem we're trying to solve, I think it's easiest to make it as concrete as possible. So many people have been talking about roboticizing all kinds of manual tasks, usually relatively low-cost tasks, which are done at scale. But there are other places where we can use artificial intelligence or analytics to actually improve our decision making or efficiency. And so let's picture the following scenario where instead of automizing a lawyer, which is basically the high frequency worker, but let's automate that which happens above the lawyer, so the management layer, the partner. And so let's imagine the following situation, which is we have a case, concrete case, which we have to tackle with our firm, and we need a team of 5 people, and we have 4 already, and we need to pick the last one. So how do we do that? How do we pick this 5th person? What will be the optimal way to do this? What is the actual way we're doing it right now? And how can we move from the actual way, if it's ideal, to the optimal way? So I think that's the question which is feels most intuitive to me to try to answer. So how do you do this? And in particular, let's say we have a sort of sphinx who you can ask a question, right? So let's say we have 100 lawyers, and you can ask the Sphinx a question to which the Sphinx gives an answer. And so what would it be we would ask the Sphinx? Or what would be the most precise question we can ask based on which we can pick up the phone, call that person, or well, whatever way we want to do it, pick the 5th person. And what is the current way we're doing it, and how can we incrementally improve this process? So I think that's the question in a nutshell, I suppose, and that's where all the complexity starts, of course. And for me, I mean, how do you think people do this right now?
In law firms right now, these sorts of decisions about what you or who you put on a team is very personality driven. It's very experience driven. A senior person in the team would say, I have worked with person A before, therefore I like person A, and he or she is going to join my team. Rarely is there any statistical or deeper data analysis that's done in the selection. Now, more and more these days, law firms are thinking about capacity, this purely quantitative factor of who has time to help out and therefore who can we bring on. But it doesn't bring into account, well, what's that person good at? What's that person's experience? What is the relationship that person might have had to the client on that matter? And all of these other variables, which I think play a greater role than simply how many hours do you have free this week?
Yeah. I mean, if you care about the performance, right? If you only care about billing hours, then possibly not.
Well, that's a strong assumption.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the many reasons why applications of AI in practice, they fail, because you don't take into account the actual capacity constraints which are there. So it's great that they are already accounted for. So there are only a limited number of hours in the end. So I think that's a very important component. But unfortunately, the way you describe it, there's very little optimization going on within the set of constraints.
So I think law firms suffer from the problem of they don't really know where to start. Yeah. And you know, you've got this experience from the management consulting space, having essentially maybe not solved this problem, but having worked on solving this problem in management consulting. So maybe I'll ask you, how is it done in management consulting?
The situation, the status quo that you described for law is very applicable to management consulting. So capacity and personal preferences and biases. So in that sense, they're very similar. So let me describe one of the added value or the advantages of working in management consulting from the perspective of selecting teams and composing teams, which is the fact that they are quite rigid in the way they collect information about their individual consultants, how they perform along a variety of axes, basically. So you'll have a performance report after every project. It will be filled out by usually the project manager. And you can relate these over time. So every 3 months you get a new one. You obviously have a lot of data on promotions, which are very formalized, etc. So in a way, it's in the management consulting, it almost fundamentally boils down to a question of bias in evaluation.
And I think in the legal industry, what we suffer from is that there's a lack of data. Now, I know of very, very few firms, and in fact, I can't think of any that does a post-mortem after every deal. At best, you might have a quarterly review of an employee's performance. Generally speaking, it's once a year. And so those are the data points that people have in terms of assessment of the performance of individuals. And that's a big span of time. And they're very infrequent little points. Supposing that is true for all law firms, that there's only annual reviews of lawyers, what other data points can we look at to get that qualitative data on performance?
Yeah. Now this is the big question. What to collect and how to collect it in a consistent and accurate way.
Let's assume there is a lawyer, there is a record somewhere that ranks lawyers out of 5 stars.
Yeah.
And that is in the database somewhere. So what would we do then?
So I guess I would ask, what would be the naive way of doing this? So which person has the best rating? But I think, an obvious qualification of this approach would be, a lot of things around this case are already set in stone. For example, the industry or the general topic of the case. So a more precise question would be, Sphinx, from all individuals who have done maybe at least 10 cases within this industry, who has the best performance? Who had the most win rate? And it doesn't have to be the same person as before, right? So you ask a more specific question, which should lead at least to better performance, because you would have the person who's best in this specific thing, right? The question is then obviously, what are these cases? Which levels do you specify? Because you can't ask 2 specific questions. We won't even if we were perfect in collecting everything, you just won't have the volume.
The way you described it, it almost sounds like you're saying, hey, pick the features that are most meaningful first.
Exactly. Yeah.
And one of the things that I think we're going to have trouble with inside the legal industry is that those features are not necessarily measured. And so what would work as proxies for those features? And I can tell you the data that is gathered by law firms, and it's gathered with great stringency. It's time. Everything is billable time. And so you have a lot of record on what lawyers have done, how they spent their time, and generally they'll give a narrative description of what they spent their time doing. On the flip side of that is you can see what documents and what words were written during those time periods, or what words were read during that time period. And so without this external qualitative assessment by more senior partners, you do have time record and documentary record. So then what would you do with those 2 parcels of data, and what can we possibly extrapolate?
Now, I think this is a crucial part, this content-based predisposition. So I think actually on learning this, it's very interesting, because management consultants don't necessarily have this finesse in the way that people actually do their work. So how many hours do they spend on this part and that part, and what's their preference in it? So this is, I think, a fascinating, for me, new world that would open. So I've worked much more with, for example, the traits and the personality traits of individuals, and how does a team of very dominant people together feel, even though every individual one seems to be a high performer. But I think this is truly, this is something which I think the law scene might be fairly unique in a way, that you can actually go so precisely into the way a person does his or her job, like content based. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and I think it's not utilized at the moment. At least it's not utilized by anyone I've spoken to. So I guess maybe I'll turn the question around and go back to this features idea that we spoke about a few minutes ago, which is, if we were to have the Sphinx, and the Sphinx has all the power in the universe, what do you think are the up to five most meaningful features that you would look for in assembling a team?
In professional services, you need a baseline familiarity with what you're supposed to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think most people would maybe, you need that one. And after that, in this case, it's the other 4 team members. Hands down. I would say it's the interaction which will be generated. Unless it's a type of business where you can really decompose the tasks at hand and everyone works in a sort of independent way. But generally speaking, at least in the management consulting sphere, I would say that the composition is most leading. So the energy that's created by the interaction between individuals, which is not something which stands on its own. It's not the case that you can always assemble the 5 best people. It's in the context of the project which is going to be done. So the relationship with the client, etc. So it's more complicated than maybe illustrated first. So I would say the people plus the high level context of the case. So what is the industry? What is the type of work that has to be done? High pressure, low pressure, etc. I think that will be the key ones I would look at first.
From two aspects. One, the way that legal work is compartmentalized and broken out, you do find in a lot of cases there are very clear dividing lines. So I'll give you an example from a transaction where if you're doing a merger and acquisition, you would have a corporate lawyer or corporate team leading this transaction. But then the specific issues that arise, like employees and tax, they go to specialists and they do siloed work. And it doesn't really matter about personalities in that case. But what does matter is your core M&A team, your corporate associates and partners. They have to work well together and they have to work well with the client, which is a really difficult to measure thing. And I think this is why at the moment, the current practice is partners will go, I like person A, I like to work with them, therefore we're going to have them on the team, even if they're not the most skilled person.
Now, I can definitely see that. And I can see it's also, I mean, we always deride the strategy in a way. It just seems like the most sort of stupid thing to do. But I actually personally think that it's a pretty good heuristic in a limited information setting. So that's a lot of complexity to take into account, definitely.
It's a web.
Yeah, indeed. But I mean, if you're able to define the axes and make a matrix, and you can actually fit every client or every aspect of a case into it, you at least go some way into determining the context of the case. So with context, I mean the things you cannot change. It's people you have to work with, the client. It's the context of the case in content-wise, duration, even whatever. So I think these things have to be set in stone because it's so. If the variation between cases is large, then this is the most important one to actually find some way to get a grasp on it, some way to categorize it. So I think, intuitively speaking, that will be one of the ways to make progress, to find classification. And it can be, I mean, we don't have to be perfect from the start. We just have to be able to start looking at. So let's say a table of the following form. So every row is a type of case. And we have maybe 5, which is way too few, but let's say how we start.
We'll start somewhere, right?
Like, exactly.
Yep.
And then we have 4 types of so 5 like rows and 4 types of let's say 4 types of lawyers in this case. So we neglect the interaction between the team, etc.
Yep.
And we just want to see performance. We want to see how type A lawyer does for every 5 of the different types of cases. And we just want to look at this data and say like, okay, so we see that the type A lawyers are best in case type D and case type E. For B, they're all round, doesn't really matter, they just perform well everywhere. C is maybe only good in A and B, etc. And that's just a starting point, something to look at. And the moment you look at it, you know it's wrong. You just know that we have to be more specific, right? It's just, I mean, it's just too high level. And that's the moment when we decide to either split up one of these columns to
Yep.
be more specific,
Yep.
or split up one of the rows to be more specific. And we
Mm.
just have to keep on doing this iterative process until we're happy with the way this matrix, and it can get very large, obviously.
Mm.
We have to feel comfortable with the granularity of the rows and the columns. So I think we have to have a high-level categorization of cases, a high-level categorization of lawyers, and then we even discard the whole team complexity. I think that will be the starting point.
Mm.
And I mean, I'm not sure, because I think it's not straightforward. It wasn't straightforward in management consulting, but so every cell in this table is the performance of this type of lawyer for this type of case. But are we able to generate performance? Is it straightforward?
I think so. I mean, you can have client feedback that tells you, are they happy? And sometimes you even have actual measurements, like if you go to court, did you win or did you lose? And so I think it is measurable. And I really like the idea that you suggested, which is start somewhere, create a matrix, start putting it down, and then you'll know where the gaps are, and then you'll know what to break apart, be more nuanced. I do have an interesting question, which is measurable improvement. What sort of uplift can we expect looking at other industries if law firms were to start taking this Moneyball approach to picking teams?
So the question is, how much can you actually, so how well does this matrix discern differences in performance? But let's say, I mean, if it's reasonable that a type of lawyer has a performance of 30%, where 30% of the cases this person does have a reasonably successful outcome, and this person has 70% in some other type of case, and that 40%, as this delta, this gap between the two becomes larger, that's where the possible gain is. Because right now, this type lawyer A is just randomly assigned to A and B.
Yep.
So basically, if it's a 50-50 split, this person will have 50% success. But if you would just assign this person to type D, which this person has 70% success, well, that 20% more case of success, that's your gain. That's a possible efficiency gain. The question is it as straightforward as that, and are the gaps as large as this?
Right. And what's the cost in producing the data in order to have this efficiency gain?
Exactly. So it's complicated. It's very difficult to know how much to be gained from this. There are also completely different performance metrics or outcome metrics to take into account. So let's say you as a law firm assume that you always get a reasonable outcome. It's just time invested. How much time did it cost person A or person B? And we want to minimize time, which maybe be a perverse incentive because you want to bill more. So this is definitely a question here.
Well, it's changing. The landscape is morphing towards profit rather than revenue.
Right, I see. So, because in an efficiency perspective, it will be completely reasonable to. So, let's say in a fixed fee contract, maybe a management consulting setup where you bill a number of hours predetermined, and then you just have to do the work basically. Then it will be a strong incentive to make sure that you assemble the team which does it in the least amount of time in the most efficient way. So there you would have a sort of, the cells wouldn't be success or not. The cells would be number of hours necessary for a success. There's something else, and that would be a different perspective how you look at the possible gains to be had. So if there is a strong intuition amongst law firm partners or stakeholder shareholders in a way right now that some people are just good at something and bad at other things, and it costs a lot more time, well, that delta is your potential efficiency gain. But I mean, I agree, it's extremely difficult to know a priori what these differences are, because if it's just a percentage point or something, it's really marginal, the possible gain you get into optimizing allocation of people to cases. So it really is it's an intuition question at the heart.
But if it's as big as 20% from just allocating one person around, then that's an enormous gain.
Exactly.
It almost, I mean, you can break it down like any business problem. It almost feels like you have to determine the objective first. Then you just have to start taking actions. You have to experiment and go, right, we have this amount of data, we have this available. Let's see what we can do, and then iterate from that point onwards.
Exactly. I mean, and you can do it in all kinds of parts in the process. If you look at roboticizing or automating, or at least giving decision support to the management level, it's even fair to say, for example, in picking the cases you take up as a law firm, do I want to do this or not? And basically using this type of approach, what is my availability right now? What do I know of these types of lawyers doing this type of case? And actually having a sort of decision support in terms of, okay, we only have a 30% probability of actually doing this successfully.
Right.
Will be a different part, right? It's the same data, it's the same. So I think law firms have to be very pragmatic here, and I think about where do we think this lack of decision support is the biggest. Where can we improve the most? And
Pick the
it's very
low-hanging
difficult.
fruits.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because obviously you have to think about how difficult it is. So which proxies matter for this specific optimization problem?
Yep.
Can we get them?
There's a really active field in legal tech at the moment, and that's case law analytics, looking at judges, looking at the circumstances, and then measuring, well, what's the likelihood that this argument will succeed in front of this judge? And I think this conversation is kind of creating a much more broad spectrum data analytics problem of who do we pick as our team? Do we even take on a case given this is a team that we have? And that's fascinating, Mark. I think your insights on that's just phenomenal, and the parallels to the management industry is extremely informative.
The differences are also very interesting, I must say. But in the end of the day, I mean, it's this matrix thinking about we know this is external, the case before us, and this is what we choose, and finding a way to fill this first matrix, even if it's scuffed in all kinds of ways, just start looking at it, start trying to dig. I think it's very widely applicable in marketing, in management consulting. It's just basic data analytics, of course. So it's in a way, it's the parallels are so many, but they're always very interesting nuances. Where I think law tech or legal work is just such a fascinating sub-specific domain here.
Yeah, I would love for a law firm to listen to this, pick it up and say, hey, let's experiment. Because I think knowing what the potential impact would be from this type of work would be possibly game changing. And if a firm says let's experiment for 6 months, I think that would be fascinating.
Yeah, no, I mean, this type of problem is so rich. I would definitely love to get on it.
Oh well, look, we'll do what we can. And Mark, I've had so much fun chatting. I think the insights you've given, the kind of pointers as to the actual steps people can take, is hopefully going to spark someone inside of a law firm to take these steps. And if they do, would love to hear from them to see what the results are.
Of course.
And thank you again for your time.